So crime, the chapter you guys have maybe all been waiting for. This is actually just a quote or taken from a piece from something else. It was a case that went through a while back. It really doesn't have anything to do with crime, but it has to do with law, and I think an important part of the First Amendment. In fact, reminder that today actually there is a First Amendment speaker on campus. Unfortunately, I can't attend. Something that maybe some of you ought to consider. I think it would be interesting talking about First Amendment on campuses. But anyhow, this is 2011. It's a while back, but I think it really shows the level to which we hold the First Amendment dear, in spite of how awful some things are. And in this case, it's an 8-1 decision. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of Phelps. If you remember and I haven't heard of them lately doing this, but there was a church called the Westboro Baptist Church, and their leader and some of their members would protest soldiers' funerals. Nothing against the funerals in particular, but their protest was that the reason the soldiers had died in combat was that the United States was being punished because we allowed homosexuality. And protesting soldiers' funerals and on and on. What a pathetic thing. And yet the Supreme Court upheld their right to do that. The demonstrations were peaceful, on and on and on. But most of us find that pretty abhorrent. And yet, the Supreme Court said, hey, it's a First Amendment thing. That's not to say that there aren't some restrictions on First Amendment. I think Thurgood Marshall was the one who famously said you can't yell fire in a crowded theater when in fact there is no fire, because the ensuing chaos can cause damage and whatnot. So, false free speech that causes harm, is perhaps not a protected speech. So anyhow, crime. Right? Means to punish wrongdoers, okay, in the business sense we're talking about here, right? Crimes are wrong against society, which, can be wrong against individuals as society, I guess you might say. So, and they're both federal, state, and in some cases local penal codes that come into play here. So originally we didn't really talk about crime when we talked about business law for whatever reason. It just wasn't that big of a deal, I guess, in terms of business, and so it wasn't really discussed. It's been added lately. For the last 20 years, there's been some very high-profile crimes that have taken place, and a few of those I'll talk about. Some of them are getting dated. I probably need to update my stuff. It's ones that I've incorporated, mainly because I had some funny cartoons to incorporate them, like Bernie Madoff, for example. And if you went back and Googled Bernie Madoff, you could read about him, and he had an investment company, and basically what he did is for years then, he was falsifying the statements that he was sending to clients. Nobody else at his firm really got implicated, so he was doing this apparently himself, sending out statements to his customers showing that they were doing exceptionally well, even though they were not. And of course, most clients would leave their money with him. Occasionally he would have some that needed to make withdrawal or whatever, and he tried to keep enough cash on hand to do that. When the crisis hit in 2007, that's people wanted out, and he didn't have the money, and that's when the house of cards all came tumbling down, and it turned out he'd just been falsifying those statements while himself living a fairly high life. So. Oh, and then there's Martha Stewart. Okay, hers was insider trading, and perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit more. But Martha Stewart's resurrected herself, and this goes back, this is 2004, something like that. So it goes back quite a way, but you'll still hear about Martha Stewart now, and she's kind of come out of it and kind of done okay. She did spend 6 months in the Huskow and another 6 months under house arrest. So kind of interesting. Her crime ended up being, well, she was the event that caused it was insider trading. Her crime actually ended up being obstruction of justice, which we'll talk about later. Then there was the famous Enron scandal. You can read this. You just for the humor. Enron scandal's getting quite old. Several people that worked for Enron, though, and we talk about this in a little bit, were actually convicted themselves, including their leader, their CEO, Ken Lay. Turns out that, just to give you the basics, they were publicly saying that the company was doing extremely well, and they were cooking the books to make it look like the company was doing well. At the same time, many of them were selling their own stock in the company. And then, like usually happens, the poop hit the fan, and it turns out the company wasn't doing well, that they had been falsifying documents, committing fraud, and as a result, a lot of people lost a lot of money, and people that had worked for Enron lost retirement, and on and on and on. So pretty nasty. So again, crimes are wrong against society. It's prohibited by statute. Now this, my little funny here is really old, because boy, I feel a lot safer now that she's behind bars. That's in reference to Martha Stewart. O.J. Simpson is still walking around, which he is now. He was in jail there for a while. Osama bin Laden too, although he's gone to meet his maker. But they take the one woman in America, willing to cook, clean, and work in the yard, and they haul her butt off to jail. So yeah. Because Martha Stewart was a home, like a professional homemaker, and telling folks how to, do things, telling purportedly anyhow other women how to do things properly in the home in terms of taking care and cleaning and gardening and everything else. So crime, something that's inherently wrong, which I suppose that's the Latin for inherently wrong, although I don't know, deemed wrong by legislature or by statutes, right? White collar crimes is often what we refer to, right? Can be committed by the entities themselves or desk workers. It can be somebody fairly low in the structure, in the organization. Accountants and attorneys that are actually third parties to the business and the customers that they have, and then of course officers, and that's probably the most common, other than maybe the entities themselves. There's been some recent ones that have been moved towards, and this is where there's a gray area between civil and criminal. You've seen like banks settle. Wells Fargo's had some settlements in regards to their actions here recently. Most of that's been civil. Okay, they haven't really pursued criminal charges. Sometimes it's, well, we'll talk about the criminal side of it, I guess, as we go on. Maybe I can explain that a little bit better. But, a number of arrests for various white-collar crimes. So, forgery, counterfeiting, quite a few, really. Fraud, you see quite a few, although came down. My guess is it popped up after that 2007. It's kind of an older deal. Some of those, some of these are old simply because it's hard to get really up-to-date statistics, right? So, classifications, we can of course have a felony, which is an indictment. Felonies can be also at the state level. At our state level, there, the indictment will come from county attorney, okay, or district attorney maybe, but I think it's county attorneys, and it can result in fine or imprisonment. Federal, in the state of Montana anyhow, federal indictments for felony charges do come down, I think, always or almost always from a grand jury. Misdemeanors, a government charge, so these are going to be brought by just a government agent, that can bring the indictment, which could be, probably is an attorney, a county attorney or a federal district attorney, those types of agents. Generally result in a fine or jail of less than 1 year. So you go back to Martha when she spent 6 months, hers probably ended up being a misdemeanor charge of obstruction of justice. There has to be intent, right? And this is where sometimes the criminality of it gets to be a little more difficult to prosecute, because you have to have that intent where somebody willfully, knowingly, and voluntarily participated in it. And you get with a corporation that has 200,000 employees and things going on, sometimes proving that intent is difficult, whereas remember the standard of proof is less when we do a civil case, and so a lot of those are prosecuted in a civil court or under civil rules because it's a little bit easier to prove. You're not going to throw people in jail. You've heard complaints about that. Why weren't there any bankers in jail after the financial crisis? Again, it's difficult to prove that, but banks paid a lot of big fines, billions and billions and billions of dollars in fines. Okay, and easier to prosecute under those particular rules. Pleas that we can have, right? It can be a guilty plea, of course, or a not guilty plea. Okay, and then there's the nolo contender, which means no contest. In fact, I've never ever seen it in print say nolo contendere or whatever the heck you pronounce that. But I have seen the no contest. In Montana, I see, and this could be other states too. I don't know, but we hear an Alford plea, and I describe that as being pretty much the same, I think, as a no contest plea, which says, we recognize, if we're the defendant in this case, that there may be enough evidence to prosecute us, but we're not going to admit that we did it. Okay, and one of the reasons, of course, that you would do that is that later on, if some evidence or something comes forward to exonerate you, nobody can say, hey, you pled guilty. Okay, no, you say, no, I realized that at the time there was enough evidence, so I didn't plead guilty. I pled no contest. In order to not have to go through the courts and all those other things. Might spend some time in jail, might do some things like that, but eventually could be freed if evidence later proved that. So, okay, it's probably also a plea that comes up often, just as a way to simplify the process. The prosecutor wants you to plead guilty, and I'm not going to plead guilty, right? And so you agree to plead this. Take certain punishment, and away you go. Oh, my PowerPoint is stuck. Well, let's see if we can move forward here, maybe. Let's try this one. There we go. Hang on a second here. So, grand jury, okay. And again, in Montana, I'm not familiar with grand juries being impaneled for county or state crimes, but for federal crimes, certainly. Okay, a grand jury determines if enough evidence exists to proceed with a trial. And again, for state crimes, here locally, in fact, our county attorney's been in the news quite a bit, unfortunately, but you see that our county attorney is the one that indicts and determines if enough evidence exists to proceed. But when we get to the federal level, murder, high crimes like that, a grand jury's impaneled to make that determination. They don't determine the guilt or innocence. That's not their job. Okay, citizen jurists. I don't know why it says 23 of them are impaneled. I don't think they actually have 23 that sit. They might start with a bigger panel and then pare it down. But I might be wrong about that. Again, there's that presumption of innocence, okay, just like there would be going forward, at the start of a regular trial. The subpoena power, so a grand jury can subpoena, okay, they can subpoena people to come and testify, they can subpoena documents, they can subpoena those things. And unlike regular court proceedings, their proceedings are secret, okay? They can meet in secret, but again, they're not determining the guilt or innocence, they're just determining whether or not this move forward. Okay, so grand juries, yeah, they have a lot of power. Yeah, they get to meet in secret, but again, they're not the ones that determine the guilt or innocence. So let's pause there, and we'll come back for part 2 in a bit.